Welcome to the ninth episode of the Sports World with Patrik. So, for the next 2 weeks, we'll be focusing more on the hockey side of the the sports world. Of course, this time we're not staying in the North American continent. We're actually going to go ahead and we are going to go to Sweden and around to Europe. So, the first league that we're going to start off with, since in the United States uh, we just brought the PWHL, the new professional women's hockey league, to the United States. We're going to go to the Swedish women's hockey league. Of course, this is the SDHL. The SDHL first started, their first season was in 2007. Of course, most of these leagues are in Sweden at the moment, are actually controlled by the Swedish Ice Hockey Federation or Ice Hockey Association. And before the SDHL, to give you some history, before when it was established in 2007, it was actually called the Risarine, and um, and that was of course changed during the 2016-17 season. So it started off with that. Of course, it does have a total of 10 teams in the SDHL. Of course, in the SDHL, they do allow for body checking, which is very rare around the world. In women's hockey, of course, Sweden obviously trying it out at the moment, so they uh, they are definitely starting to move the game more towards a physical aspect on the women's side. So of course, so to introduce you to a little bit to the STHL, they do play 36 games in a season, and then after the season, of course, 6 teams qualify for the championship, and then of course the top 2 teams, they're given bye weeks, so it sort of works out exactly like how the NFL playoffs start off, how the top seeds in both the NFC and the AFC get that bye week. That's the top 2 teams, and this year it just happened to be the top 2 teams in the SHL were, it looks like, uh, Lola, Misk, and Modo were the top 2 teams in the SHL. And actually, it does look like they did change the format for this year, so all 6 teams were actually so there was actually 8 teams playing this year in the SDHL. So it does look like they have changed their playoff format since their initial beginning of the league. Now, of course, in this league, it's very much like if you watch Ted Lasso. Not all the teams remain in the SDHL that are in the SDHL. Of course, there are other teams that are there that are fighting sort of for that. Uh, they're fighting for a chance to play in this league, with it being the top tier league in the Swedish hockey league. Of course, it has some of the highest attendance among women's hockey, and since most of these SDHL teams are also connected with their SHL, which is going to be in the next episode here, which is the men's side, they normally share the same rink and work their schedule around. They're normally led by the same leadership group at the beginning of the season. Of course, um, if you are in the bottom part of this team, of course, they do have a certain, just as I mentioned with Ted Lasso. If you remember the first season of Ted Lasso, Ted Lasso's team does become relegated to the bottom league. Of course, for the SDHL, if you do get sort of relegated, you do get relegated to the Nationally Dumb Hockey Liga, which is, of course, the lower end of the league. You can get demoted, relegated from there too. Now, unlike where the SDHL is sort of its governance is over. Of course, the governance over it for is led by the Michigan, or not Michigan, sorry, but Swedish Hockey Federation or Hockey Association. This one is sort of, they work with the regional ones. So, and of course with the SDHL being the women's national league in Sweden, it does get um, very competitive in there. Recently, of course, some players have been leaving the SDHL once the PWHL came uh, to life. So, of course, with all that, they do have the 10 teams in there, and I'll go ahead and give you the teams that are actually in there for the 2023-2024. So they have AIK, which is in Solna, Sweden. They have Brahmas IF, which is in Gave. They have Durangdes IF, which is a ice association, ice federation. I'm sorry, ice federation. That is in Stockholm, Sweden. They have Frölunda Hockey Club, which is in Gothenburg. They have the HV71, which is in Jönköping, Sweden. They have Leksanda IF, which is in Leksanda. They have, of course, Lincoln Ping HC, which is in Linköping, Sweden. They have Leola HF, or otherwise known as MSSK, which is in Leola, Sweden. They have the Modo Hockey, which is in Ornsköldsvik, Sweden. And then they have SDE, which is in Danderyd, Sweden. Of course, most of these teams, of course, are very close by on the peninsula. A few of them are more further up there. Modo is further up on the northern end of Sweden. And then, of course, Loka is the furthest north team. But most of these are sort of in that same area as Stockholm, so it makes traveling very easy for each and every one of these teams to travel. Of course, with that being said, uh, their attendance is normally pretty high for the ranks that they are in. Um, but of course, with with the league being a little more popular, and many people are worried that once the PWHL gets off to a very hot start, that the SDHL will sort of be watered down compared to the PWHL. Of course, here is one other very fun fact about the SDHL. Of course, the SDHL with their 10 teams that they have, and the regulation or the relegation odds. Of course, the top team in the NDHL, which is the lower league, for them has to play the bottom team in the SDHL, and so whichever team actually wins gets to be in the SDHL the next season. The other team does get relegated to the NDHL. So I did mention that the Swedish Ice Hockey Association is in charge of the SDHL. Of course, the SDHL is just one of many leagues that Sweden has in under the umbrella of the Swedish Ice Hockey Association, which here in the United States, the PWHL is not under neither USA Hockey or Hockey Canada's control. They sort of are under each other's. They're sort of just independently from each other. Of course, with that being said, the Ice Hockey Association was established in 1922 in Sweden. and it was, of course, had 7 representatives of clubs. And before that was ever a thing, before the Swedish Ice Hockey Association became a thing, uh, every single program in Sweden that was hockey related was sort of brought on by the Swedish Football Association, which is not to be confused with football that of the United States. But it, of course, was a their soccer for everybody here in North America, and then for everyone in Europe. Of course, the football leagues were in charge, sort of it. Of course, the the SIHA in Sweden, or SIF in Swedish, they, of course, control a lot of the leagues that are there. They have regional teams, they have domestic teams, of course. At the moment, they do have a total of 6 male national teams, including the SDHL's male counterpart, as in the Swedish Hockey League, and the Swedish Women's Hockey League is the only one at the national level at the moment that they have. With that being said, they do control 2 regional women's teams, which is, of course, the NDHL, the league that you go into or you get relegated to if you are not on you're not in the SDHL on the women's side. Of course, on the male side, they do have 4 regional areas. Of course, generally they split up in the SIF, the Swedish Ice Hockey Association here, and so they do control a lot of that. Of course, with that being said, the NDHL, of course, this would sort of be to the Americans, the AH, and the Canadians, the AHL. So if you can imagine sort of the SPHL, or not the SPHL, I'm sorry, the SDHL teams, and let's say that's the NHL teams, and then the NDHL teams competing against each other, and so you would have an AHL team trying to get into the NHL in one season. That would sort of be an interesting situation. Of course, that doesn't normally happen here. Uh, Granted, a lot of these leagues, they're very competitive, and sometimes an NDHL team could be closer to an SDHL team. But of course, with the SDHL, of course, you can get relegated from the SDHL to one more league lower than that, called the Damvatten League. Of course, that league is the lowest. The lowest is a Division 3. So that's sort of ECHL in the United States, of course. And the NDHL, of course, it's governed by all these different regions that the Swedish Hockey Association, Ice Hockey Association, sort of deals with, and it ends up, of course, being all associated with that. Of course, the IHF, the International Ice Hockey Federation, of course, they sort of have a say in some stuff. Of course, Sweden is part of the IHF. They've been an IHF member since 1922, or 1922 when they were founded. Actually, in fact, they sort of were already working on becoming IHF members before they became there. Of course, right now, Sweden is sort of one of those areas that's been growing the game, and so it's a nice thing to see. Of course, the SDHL does have a lot of good players in it. Some players are former college hockey players here in the United States who don't think they'll have a chance to be in the PWHL, so they sort of go to the SDHL and wait till they feel like they've really gotten good enough to go and play and possibly have a spot, because of course in the PWHL, not every player who gets drafted is guaranteed a spot on their team, and of course with the PWHL, this they don't really have a lower league to go to play in. Not a development just yet. We'll see if that comes along when they go ahead and start expanding. Of course, as I mentioned in the SDHL, they do allow for body checking. Of course, this is something new that's been, like I said, has been being introduced into the sport here on the female side. Of course, for the longest time, it's always been against the rules. The SDHL is always looking for ways to sort of give the fans what they want, and is definitely working with the IHF on working on this. And the IHF is actually looking into allowing body checking on the female side. Of course, the PWHL sort of got their idea of having a body checking policy, and a lot of the rules that they've established have actually came from the SDHL. The SDHL obviously tests it quite a few times. They also do test it in the NDHL. Of course, with the SDHL, this season is officially over for this year. Their next season will start later on next year. They do typically start around, I believe it's January, when they normally start their season. So they're normally pretty out there to play there. They actually do end a little earlier than most of the other leagues in the world. Of course, they do sort of run on that sense of having all the world looking at them. Of course, at the moment they are working on their off season, so they are sort of on that way to working. Actually, I'm sorry. No, they start in September, early September, and they do run all the way through the beginning of February, sort of giving their players a break for the regular season, of course, and then soon after that, the regular season starts. Or the end of the regular season is there. So, of course, they do sort of end before, they try to end before the Women's World Championship in order to ensure that the players can get enough rest against every team that they're playing. With that being said, of course, most of these players, of course, are European players just looking for a league to play in. So the SDHL, of course, this last year was a pretty interesting league. I got to watch quite a few games of it, and of course, this upcoming season we'll definitely be watching quite a few games of it as the season begins. Of course, we are just roughly a few months away from it. So once those really start, I'll definitely be recapping a lot of the SDHL into the podcast here. Of course, trying to get some SDHL players to be interviewed on this podcast. Still definitely working on that. So, but like I said, this is sort of one of those areas where we're gonna go. We're sort of going across the sea this time with hockey, and then of course we'll be going across the sea with multiple different other sports for the week, and actually for this month we're sort of going across the sea, sort of how I promised in the first episode that we would have this. So, of course, with a total of 10 teams in the SDHL, most of those being right around the Stockholm area, as I mentioned. Many of these teams, of course, they've got Olympians on them, and some of these players are also younger girls playing against adult girls, sort of trying to get used to the game of playing against older adults. And so, of course, they're a little bit more developed compared to some of the North American players that play in the NCAA. So these girls sort of, when they play, they do play a little bit more with a open mind during the a game. So they definitely do get penalties from time to time with the body checking, since in the United States at the moment in the NCAA they don't really allow for body checking, except up against the boards, I believe, at the moment. I know that's something that they're looking at, but so that is all for the SDHL episode for this week. Next, we'll on our next episode we'll actually go and look at the SHL, which is the Swedish Men's Hockey League, and then of course that's also governed by the Swedish Ice Hockey Association. So, thank you for listening to this podcast, and see you at the next episode.